This is going to be a really interesting generative discussion because we've heard everything about Canada's position on the global stage. We've talked about LNG, we've talked about the potential for hydrogen, we just heard about renewables. There's so much going on in Canada from an energy perspective, so we're going to dive right in and have a conversation with 4 individuals who are deeply involved across the spectrum in Canada's energy sector. So please welcome Colin Gruending, EVP of Liquids at Enbridge. Colin? Mike Rose, President and CEO of Tourmaline. Nagwan Al-Guneid, with the Director of the Business Renewables Centre of Canada, and Olivia Reshetylo with Modern West Advisory. I guess I'll sit here. Hey! So we're going to get started with a pretty simple question. We've heard a lot about the disaggregation of global power. We've heard a lot about the potential for LNG to displace coal and decrease emissions. We've heard about the potential for renewables in Canada, and of course we've heard a lot about hydrogen. So let's start with the obvious. What does Canada's energy future look like to each of you? And I'll start with Colin and just go through.
Future, what does it look like? Well, I'm optimistic about the future. I think Canada's got a pretty good hand here, don't you think? Like, what are we missing? I look at our hand and it's face cards. And I think any country in the world would change hands with us. We've got everything we need, both conventionally and low carbon in the future. We've got everything we need, I believe, to meet the world's needs, and I think that's what we need to do here. We've got more energy than we need, and others need it, so let's go.
But Mike, we have to get it somewhere.
Well, when I look at it, I'm extremely excited. If I was the Natural Resources Minister, I don't think I could sleep. The opportunity's so great. We've got lots of Made in Canada challenges, but I'll just talk to the opportunity. Got amongst the lowest emission, largest nat gas supplies and conventional oil in the world. On the nat gas side, we're early in productive life. So the Montney, which is the biggest source for LNG, we produced 22 of 850 TCF. So Canada, for reference, produces about 6 TCF a year. So
the reserve life index is?
Yeah, we're very long supply. Yeah, and how do we capitalize on that? It's LNG. So if we don't get our lowest emission gas to the rest of the world, higher emission sources will replace us. There's no doubt about that. The world needs natural gas, and it's going to grow along with all the energy components of the mix. Obviously, a wonderful opportunity for the Canadian economy, creating the supply every year for decades. And it is one of the best opportunities for First Nations prosperity. So it's a hat trick, and it's a game we can win.
Or it's a home run.
Yeah.
Nagwan, you've had a wide-ranging career, and now you're at Pembina at the Renewables. What's your perspective?
Yeah, so from our vantage point of view at the Business Renewables Centre of Canada, it is also promising. Alberta is right now the capital of wind and solar. Our analysis shows $3.75 billion worth of renewables construction by the end of 2023. 4,500 jobs will come with that. When we were formed in 2019, we had this 2 gigawatt by 2025 target. We crushed it 3 years in advance, and we did not see that coming. The number one driver is private companies, private investments, following their ESG commitments, addressing scope 2 emissions through renewables. And it is exciting. They're also hedging. They're locking competitive prices through long-term power purchase agreements. So this is the number one driver. And then globally, just 5 days ago, seeing research from Oxford University as well, showing that the global energy transition, green energy transition, will save trillions in net savings. It's validating technologies. It's validating the cost of these technologies. So it's exciting seeing companies delivering, and this is reflecting in this sector.
Yeah, we have the largest solar farms in Canada is located not far outside Calgary. Olivia.
I mean, I echo the excitement on this. Let me adjust my Brittany mic. Hello.
Okay,
there we go.
Yep.
It's my Brittany moment. I echo the excitement on this panel. I think the future of energy, to me, values intergenerational collaboration. It is people-centered. It's actively working towards achieving our net zero goals. And it is a little bit of a shakeup from what it looks like right now.
So, we've heard a lot about energy security, and, the German government seized 3 refineries last week belonging to Rosneft. Canada has an opportunity, but we have to play a key role in addressing the world's energy security. What do you see this as, how do you see this as playing out? What do we need to do in order to really seize that opportunity? And is it a function of working with governments here? Is it a function of working with governments overseas? How do we make sure that our energy gets to where it needs to go? Colin?
Well, seize is a very active verb, and I share the spirit of that. Like I said, we've got more energy than we need. That's obvious. We've got multiples of what we need, and that can make us pretty complacent and maybe pretty self-interested. But I think most Canadians would agree we've got a duty to share what we've got. Mike was saying, we've got the best stuff. We've got the cleanest stuff. Let's get it over there. And we can talk about egress and pipelines and terminals, but I think before we even get there, I think we have to level set as Canadians on what I said at the beginning. What we have, is that good or bad? And should we share it? And I think you have to answer that question first.
So it's about changing that energy narrative, and making sure that it's on the Canadian agenda as opposed to the Alberta's agenda.
Yeah, I think we have to remind ourselves that energy is good, emissions are bad, right?
Yeah.
And once we get past that, I think the rest falls into place, and we can get into finding social support to seize the day we're talking about.
We like active verbs. It's all good.
Yeah.
Nagwan, what do you think? What do we need to do?
I think it's very hard to make sense of energy policy at the moment with the news cycle. And the Russian invasion has for sure sent this energy shock in Europe. It prompted that shock, but it can also prompt an acceleration towards decarbonization. And maybe a good way of looking at this is short-term versus long-term. So in the short term, absolutely, Europe is in trouble. It's looking for immediate solutions. It's looking for increased supplies, and that's why the more European countries impose sanctions, the more they'll be putting pressure on OPEC countries to produce more for that supply. But when you look at the long term, Europe still is very committed to decarbonizations and to emission reduction. It's still committed to their Fit for 55, which is reduction of 55% of their emissions by 2030. They're instituting the border carbon mechanism, which is basically putting tax on imports from countries that do not have the same climate ambition. And they're considering even accelerating wind and solar power. So I think it's important to look at the Russian invasion and the energy security in that short term. How do you get immediate supply in the next 2-3 years? But then in the long term, I think as Canada, we need to keep an eye for that long-term decarbonization, electrification, and how can we play in that space.
So Mike, what Najwan's talking about is really that sort of short-term, long-term horizon. But in your opinion, let's talk about that temporal disconnect, because we have these targets, and it seems to be that because of the energy security situation, there's been a lag that's been introduced in terms of really moving along that time horizon that people had committed to, but now seem to be reconsidering.
Yeah, I mean, back it up a little. I think what we really need to do, and this kind of dovetails with what Colin was saying, is we actually need a real environment energy strategy that looks at all the aspects. So the economic aspects, the environmental performance improvement aspects, security, and affordability, and all those are important. And we don't have that right now. We sort of have an environmental policy and an energy policy, and they're kind of disconnected. And when we get that in place, then I think we can do something. And strategy in like strict business terms means securing a competitive advantage. That's why you create a strategy. And I think Canada has a competitive advantage, and I don't think we should squander it.
So we have resources, but we also talk about our competitive advantage being our ability to do really well in terms of the ESG metrics, environment, social, and governance. We do those letters very well. Not sure that everybody understands where we rank in that context. Olivia, are we getting credit for those advances that we've made on the ESG front? And how closely is our energy future tied to the ESG?
Yeah, I think credit where credit's due, and I think when people think about Canadian energy, there are words that are synonymous with that. I do think that ESG itself provides a framework and an opportunity to continue to build trust and transparency between industry and its stakeholders. And we need to communicate more honestly through that and leverage ESG as a tool to be able to do that.
Just as a reminder, we are taking questions on Slido, so if anybody wants to ask us a question, please use your Slido app and let us know what you're thinking. So the growth of Canada's energy sector was largely funded by foreign capital, and our provincial energy minister was recently at an energy conference in Norway and said that she'd heard from investors that they are concerned about political stability in Alberta and are considering allocating capital elsewhere. What does that mean for the energy sector and the potential to develop our resources and really do what we can do?
I'll bite on that. So, you know, we allocate capital as an investor, as Mike's company does, to different businesses in different jurisdictions.
Yep.
And there's a pretty basic jurisdictional screen when you run through it. There's 6 or 7 big rocks you gotta have, and Canada's got most of them, right? Democratic society, rule of law, currency stable, you know, reasonable government take and taxes and dividends or royalties, etc. Skilled workforce, mobility. But there's one box that's unchecked, right? And it's the regulatory certainty. And no company or private investor or any pool of money is going to invest in a place where there's a big question mark in that box. So if we can move to what Mike was saying about a little more clarity and integrated strategy, just clarity.
Yeah.
Even just regulatory certainty, timelines. You'll get an answer. You may not like it, but you'll get an answer in 24 months. Like Senator Manchin's trying to do right now in the U.S., right?
Yep.
Trying to find some clarity through the fog. I think that's the last box Canada needs to check, and we've got them all checked.
I think we need to show that we can actually build a large project and complete it and bring new volumes on. So, I mean, that's one of the really attractive things of Coastal GasLink and LNG Canada and the Trans Mountain expansion. Let's get those done, and then we can demonstrate to the world that we are real. And part 2 of the energy strategy is that we need what the pipeline approval process is, what the timeline is, and you know, we will build them safely and in the most environmentally responsible way. But capital will come
Right.
if we show that we can execute on these large projects. We have the resource, but it's part 2 that we're working on.
It's a certainty. Nagwan.
I agree with a lot of that. I think investors are looking for a comprehensive and a credible climate policy as well. They're looking for targets. Currently, right now, the government of Alberta does not have a net zero target by 2050, net emission reduction by 2030. We don't have a 2035 net zero grid by 2035. If anything, this underscores how the narrative is very important and the regulatory system is very important. It's that business certainty that we need, and Alberta right now is not showing up as a partner in this national commitment to decarbonize and attract the trillions of dollars in the energy transition. We're fighting a lot. We are fighting the feds, we're fighting the municipalities, we're fighting the environmental communities, and this narrative is not helpful. It creates a big investment risk.
So there's a bunch of questions that have just come up, but I just wanted to ask Olivia, this is sort of, how do we, one of the routes to really growing the energy sector and ensuring its long-term growth and prosperity really is also about attracting that next generation of talent. I think you're the youngest person on the panel. So why don't you tell us about what that means in terms of attracting that intergenerational talent and where, what else needs to be done? Is it that values-based conversation that really focuses on ESG practices? What is it?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, I think I'm here to speak on behalf of youth who want to be a part of this energy transition, and that's the bottom line. And so it's about how do we create the right conditions for them to be able to engage in industry and see themselves represented within these organizations and have the ability to make change. And so I think there's a lot of ways that we can go about making meaningful intergenerational collaboration happen. And one of those ways is by companies taking ownership and being more honest in setting ambitious targets, being honest about trying to meet net zero, working to create environments that are honest and transparent and are clear that there are challenges and invite young people to come and try and solve them. And I think if we can do a better job of showcasing the opportunity for young people who care so deeply about the climate crisis to have impact within the industry, then we will see talent coming back to the energy industry.
So I think there's a question that addresses what you've just talked about, that conundrum. How do you square LNG with climate targets? The growth of LNG seems incompatible with our environmental needs. Who wants to take that? You want to take that?
Sure. Well, it's a bit about carbon leakage, and I touched on it. I mean, first of all, natural gas is a fossil fuel, fully acknowledged. It is the most energy dense and the cleanest burning of the group, but it is a fossil fuel. But the reality is, it is the fastest growing energy segment of the whole stack, and it will be supplied by jurisdiction with much higher emissions than we have. So if we don't supply it, it's actually on a net basis worse for the global atmosphere. Secondly, no sector is working harder on emission reduction than the Canadian sector, be it oil sands, conventional oil, or nat gas. And it's a whole series of little incremental wins that add up to a much larger victory. I mean, nat gas intensity is down 40%. 2012 versus 2020. And lastly, if you just want to put Canadian emissions in context, we're 1.5% of global emissions right now. Our sector collectively is about a third of that, so call it 0.5%. And we're working really hard on knocking that down by 0.1 or 0.2%. And I really think we'll get there because the whole industry is committed to that. But Russia, China, India, they've all committed to growing their emissions at a much greater annual rate than that for multiple years for at least a decade. So yes, we will attack our 0.2%, but it's a good Pearl Jam lyric. How much difference does it make?
I forgot you were a Pearl Jam fan, but I'm not going to let you off the hook too quickly. Thoughts on the PM's comments that there's no business case for LNG. How do we address that type of thinking at the policy and government level? You can take that and we can go on.
Well, I guess we all strongly disagree, and there's an outstanding business case, full stop.
Okay.
So,
Colin.
Well, I entirely agree. And what's the LNG displacing? It's displacing coal for the most part, which is a win. And it's a relative game here. Perfection is probably unrealistic. And so it's a relative game of incremental wins. And LNG beats coal, and Canada LNG beats other LNG. It's that simple.
But how do you there is a business case, we know that, but for some reason that's not resonating in the places where it needs to resonate. What do we need to do to change that mindset?
That's a big question. I think one thing to think about is there might be a business case for LNG. I've learned a lot in the last couple of months, changing roles, working from a youth empowerment org, moving into a new organization that works within industry. I am blown away by how much I've learned in the last 2 months about folks that are working in the industry and what they're doing. And it just makes me think, wow, there was a lot I didn't know. And why don't I know that? Where is that information getting lost? Where is that storytelling falling apart? Because there's a big opportunity within this industry for young people to make impact. And so when we think about these projects and moving forward with them, this is my energy future. This is young people's energy future. I want to feel represented in that decision to move forward with LNG. And so how are you bringing stakeholders to the table to be a part of that decision making? And I think that's whether or not they move forward or not, you have to bring the right people to the table so that the decision is made in a representative way.
In a representative way that's also, from a time perspective, also efficient.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've seen a lot of really interesting activity take place in Alberta, really on the innovation side. And I guess there's a question about how can the energy sector better support innovation to decrease emissions, increase efficiency, decrease emissions, decrease costs. Just curious as to what you see going on and what else can be done to further those objectives. Where does innovation play? How are companies addressing it? Sure. What else do you need to do?
Well, we're doing it internally and externally. I mean, we have a team of kind of 7 young engineers working on basically clean tech and technologies to reduce emissions. And it's exciting and it's challenging and it's an opportunity for young people, lots of you in this room to enter the industry. We corroborate. I mean, on the gas side, we have Natural Gas Innovation Fund, and so companies getting together and sharing technologies and continuing to reduce emissions. And really the mantra is like get better every day, and that's what we're trying to do. And then we have to educate the public. So we have to do an increasingly better job. We think we're trying, but obviously we're not doing that well on what we're doing. And to get back to your last question, that's how you win on the advocacy front. If enough of the public realizes that, hey, these guys are doing a pretty good job and Canada's got a real opportunity here, the government will do what the public wants.
Is NGIF getting the kind of traction that you hoped it would in terms of what it's trying to do?
I believe so, but the most important thing is they're actually creating technologies or encouraging technologies that will reduce emissions. So, I mean, that's actually the most important thing. And there are some, big opportunities coming. At one point, when my hair was a different color, I actually ran a research center. And you can't push research. It happens, and it happens when it happens, and you can't put an arbitrary timeline like 2030 or 2050 on it. But there's absolutely no doubt in my mind that technology will solve our environment, our climate, and our emissions problems. Most of the wins are small. Once in a while, you get something big.
Can I jump in on the innovation question?
Absolutely.
So I think maybe to back up a step, I'm a big believer that the big energy players of today will probably be the big energy players of tomorrow. Lots of skill sets in-house at these organizations, lots of will to compete and find competitive edge. And I don't think a lot of big companies and organizations are going to wait around for policy to magically form and presciently set the course in a pretty complicated energy world, right? So I think a lot of companies are innovating. I can list off 4 or 5 we're doing. We've been investing in renewables for 21 years. We're mixing hydrogen into natural gas streams to test 1% blending, 2%, and so on. Use existing infrastructure. We've only got 35,000 kilometers of main in Toronto. I may as well use it.
Yeah.
Right? We're building a hydrogen plant and exporting ammonia. innovations socially as well. I could go into that. But I think my point is the leaders of today will probably be the leaders of tomorrow because they're going to compete to find that space.
Just quickly, I think we need a mix of factors. Again, when I look at the renewables sector and the boom we're having right now, it just didn't happen randomly. There was an innovative government policy, and it doesn't have to be controlling and so intervening. But back in 2015, the government of Alberta did create the REP program, which is the Renewables Electricity Program, which basically proved the business sense for the contract for difference. And the private sector took off. The renewable sector is not subsidized. When you hear about big deals signed in Alberta right now, Amazon, Microsoft, TC Energy, big companies coming and buying here, this is the result of an innovative policy. And we need more of these innovative policies to de-risk, and then the private sector and other players can take off from there.
Yeah, if I could even just add to that too, from a youth perspective, awesome organization, Student Energy, did a global youth energy outlook that surveyed 40,000 youth in over 130 different countries. And over half of that survey group identified lack of government policy as one of the biggest barriers to achieving a net zero future. So I think you can echo that from a young person's perspective. There is a need for policy.
So the questions come up, and it sort of refers to something that Mike started off in his opening comments, and Colin, I think, referred to as well. And it's the panel's thoughts on Indigenous equity, ownership in Canada's energy future, and what that looks like.
Sure. Go ahead, Mike, sorry.
Oh, no, that's fine. You go. Yeah, I was just reading the question.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I was going to...
Because you talked about social innovation.
I was going to go there. This is, I think, a big opportunity for Canada on multiple files, and I think it could be a nexus to accomplish many of these. Certainly, there's the way forward. Enbridge believes in Canada is to partner with Indigenous communities, like really partner. I'm talking about economic co-investment, economic partnership. Full alignment with a place at the table, an inside the tent view, economic stewardship, jobs, economic sovereignty. I think that's the path forward here. I think there's a lot of room for it. We interact with our linear pipeline networks. We actually interact with over 300 Indigenous nations, and so we haven't always got it right. I think there's a lot of humility that needs to be brought to this conversation by all. But a lot of learnings have been learned, and we can build on it.
Mike, you referred to it in your opening comments about what the potential was.
Yeah, for sure. A growing Canadian LNG business, I think, is a really good route to improving First Nations prosperity, and again, the participation is critical. And an emissions cap doesn't square with that. Cutting growth off, in 2030, and it's actually good to see a number of First Nations objecting to the, what the consequences are of a cap for growth in their prosperity and long-term prosperity, not short-term.
You're talking about the emissions cap that's been proposed by Environment and Climate Change Canada.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I want to preface this question with that the energy system today was built with zero input from First Nations, Métis people, Inuit here in Canada. So this is something we need to acknowledge. So the energy transition can present this opportunity for us right now. And this is what we were trying to raise awareness on at the Business Renewables Centre Canada, is Indigenous equity in renewable projects and majority Indigenous equity. These projects need to be Indigenous-led. It can't be consultation anymore. It can't be just duty to consult. Like, this is very old language now, so we're focusing on call action number 92, which is economic reconciliation. It's true economic benefit and equity with the Indigenous peoples.
Olivia, when you were at Student Energy, I'm sure this conversation came up quite a bit in terms of how the Indigenous communities can participate in energy development.
Yeah, I think how Indigenous communities participate in the energy future is up to Indigenous communities to decide. And part of that, and I think part of the work that Student Energy was doing, is educating Indigenous youth on how to get involved in the industry in a way that feels meaningful to them. And so how do young people lead on building those partnerships centered around their values and what they see the energy future like, and other folks, industry, coming to the table to first listen and then figure out how they can help support pushing those visions forward.
So we know that the Canadian government has set its net zero targets, and we have the Pathways to Net Zero consortium that's also moving in that direction. And there's a question that's come up that says, is net zero even achievable, and is setting goals that are so ambitious causing skepticism in the public? Would less ambitious targets get more support? So is there a bit of a disconnect from a reality perspective in terms of what's been set and what's achievable? Anybody want to take that?
They're aspirational.
Okay.
They're very aspirational, which is good in a way. I think we would all agree. We all want to strive for targets that are inspiring, but I think a dose of realism here would be good.
Yeah, I mean, our approach has been, we set 5-year plans that match our 5-year financial plans for environmental performance improvement, set hard targets, have a pretty visible technology pathway to get them, then evergreen the plan and do the next one. So we're kind of going at it in an incremental approach, and I think that builds confidence in what you can achieve. And we had the talk about technology already. I don't know where we're going to be in 2035. I do know it's going to be like a lot cleaner and way lower emission intensity for sure, and much improved on the methane side as we work through these plans. So we're kind of an execute DNA, and we look at everything through a scientific and economic lens.
The emissions cap is really trying to accelerate that net zero, what the government wants to achieve. And so I guess at some point, does it frustrate ambitions because it might not be realistic?
Yeah, you want to build it from the ground up, not from the top down with arbitrary targets and timelines. Kind of technology and improvement doesn't work that way.
And perhaps we need more carrots rather than sticks, just sort of thinking about the Inflation Reduction Act in the States and what that means for Canada and its position as it develops its energy resources and transitions from the carbon intensity. I'm just curious as to what the panel thinks in that context. What does that mean for Canadian energy? What does it mean for the deployment of technology? Canada versus the US right now.
For the Inflation Reduction Act?
Yeah.
I think this bold action by the US is like, we're no longer leading the energy transition regulations. The US is ahead of us, and it's right now a race to the top. I think the feds are putting 50% generous CCUS credit as a way to help the industry get there. So the cap, as much as it sounds negative, it is a way to show that route. Like, they put their actions on the table. The industry and Pathways have committed to net zero already by 2030, which is impressive and commendable. So it's time for the industry right now to put that back to the table. It's the how that we're all struggling with, I think.
But when the money, when you have incentives south of the border, what does that do for Canada's ambitions, I guess, is the question.
I think we're competing for capital. Like, that's the competition right now. The good news maybe is that our economy is integrated, and somehow through the supply chains we will get it will impact us in terms of emission reductions through the supply chain. But it is a race to the top, and what is it that we're going to do here in Canada to compete with the US at this point?
I'll jump in on that one.
Yeah.
I was going to use the carrot and stick. You beat me to it. And I think Canada came out of, if this is a race, Canada came out of the gates really quick. Ben Johnson-like, maybe.
Ooh, that hurts.
Pretty fast. But we may end up with a similar fate, to be honest, because we could get lapped here by the Americans with their carrots. I think they put together a pretty good package. There's pretty clear incentives, multiple types of low carbon, and we need to finish off our equation here. I think you were talking about contracts for differences or PPAs on carbon to complete the equation that emitters need to FID or finance these, and we're not there yet in Canada.
Is contract for differences a better, a sort of an efficient way to counterbalance that $85 a ton that you'll get paid?
It's something. It's a mechanism. It's better than we have nothing now. We have a question mark right now.
Yeah.
And I'll make the point. It doesn't have to be perfect. Okay? This is going to take 10, 20, 30, 40 years. So let's get something. Let's work it. Let's learn from it. We can time bound it, and we'll go from there. But let's get started. Otherwise, we'll have not much done by 2030.
Kind of like the LNG projects that we're still waiting for. So one of the things that we know is that we need all molecules in our energy future, whether it's hydrocarbons, renewables, nuclear. How does that matrix evolve, and should we be focusing on one aspect of that versus another? And how realistic, when we talk about small modular reactors, is it even reasonable? If we can't get a pipeline built, can we get a SMR constructed?
We need everything.
Okay.
So it's and, not or.
Yeah, it's not or.
So,
okay.
And the pie, the demand pie, is growing faster than any of the individual slices in the world. So we need to work on it all. Every single energy source is working on their emissions and getting cleaner, including coal. I think that's how I think SMRs are really interesting. I don't know what the regulatory piece is, but we need that. We need more nat gas. I think, over time, oil does get phased. Nat gas is the enabler for renewables. It's the enabler for hydrogen in its current form, and so we need it all.
So someone's just asked a question, and it's actually sort of speaks to what you just said. With most of Canada rich in hydro, is nat gas just a bridge, or can it survive long term? Is Alberta holding on to the past, or is it being realistic?
Well, I think we've developed most of the hydro, the easy, lower cost hydro that there is. So I see nat gas, it's still going to be a pretty important piece of the stack in 60, 70 years, kind of the life of the LNG projects.
Totally agree. And I totally agree with your comment about it backstopping reliably low carbon solutions, right?
Well, it's interesting because we have 18% of our total energy generation comes from renewable sources in Canada, but we're the second largest generator of hydroelectricity.
Yeah.
So it's, maybe to
We've
your
done
point.
a good job on it.
We've done a good job.
Yeah.
Just to quickly add to it, I mean, there's no silver bullet. We need everything at the table, 100%. Just quickly on the electrification piece and the net zero grid, we need to talk about mixed generation of clean energy sources as well. So it is, yes, we have hydro, so this is where I'm like, hello, interprovincial connectivity, where we can, when there's a supply somewhere else, we can balance it off in a different province. And when I say a mix of clean energy sources, I mean green hydrogen, biomass, renewables, hydro, and it's a mix of all that and balancing it out with that interconnectivity with other provinces when we cannot have renewables for a long term. And it helps, like, net zero grid, it has to be affordable, it has to be reliable and resilient. It has to be resilient and reliable. So I guess it's the path.
It requires coordination across provinces and across the country, and that's one of the challenges that we continue to face, is how do we knit that together?
And especially when we talk about electrification and not just decarbonization, but the supply and getting to electrification, so buildings and industrial operations, and it needs that all hand on deck approach to get there, the whole country.
So can incentives work in Canada when they're seen as being subsidies, even in the context of sort of the transformation of our energy systems?
On the gas side, we don't need them really. Maybe in the the initial R&D portion of investigating some of these clean technologies, and there are grants you can apply for, and we do that. But when it comes to CCUS, for example, it's a distributed solution with local injection, and really when we perfect the technology to process flue gas and isolate the CO2 stream, we'll just inject it. The oil sands project, that is an enormous project, and it is cool, and it is very expensive, and it will make the whole oil sands, virtually eliminate their CO2 emissions. And so I can see, why that needs to be somewhat supported by the government.
Yeah.
But, generally, I don't like subsidies.
No, yeah.
I'd like to rephrase the wording here a little bit. I think they're an investment. And I talked about our hand being all face cards.
Yep.
When we decarbonize, not if, when, we're going to have all aces. Because we're going to have an endowment of resource, we're going to have the best ESG, and we're going to have a free democracy delivering it. Nobody can match that.
And on that note, we're going to end the panel. That's an optimistic note about Canada's energy future. Please join me in thanking our panel this afternoon.